They put that out. That was a planted story.
Now I'd ask for proof of death. I worked the John Benet Ramsey case early on, and we knew by the time I was involved, there was a 3-page ransom note.
A criminal defense lawyer says a bombshell report about this case was, in his words, planted from inside the FBI itself. A profiler who helped catch the Unabomber has quietly changed the one demand he's made publicly for months. And when asked why a real kidnapper wouldn't just leave a note at the scene, he answers with a level of forensic detail that lines up, piece by piece, with details this case has already produced. Let's go through all 8. I'm Wren, the creator of the Tell Index, a framework for analyzing statements and behavior in criminal cases. Nancy Guthrie, the 84-year-old mother of Today co-anchor Savannah Guthrie, disappeared from her Tucson, Arizona home on February 1st, 2026. Today's video breaks down a Brian Entin episode from early July, taped the same evening the FBI released its official statement on the ransom notes. The same statement analyzed for internal contradiction in an earlier Tell Index episode. This one features an interview with criminal defense attorney Mark Geragos about that statement and about a possible immunity deal for someone with information, followed by a replayed clip of retired FBI profiler James Fitzgerald, who has appeared in this series before with a specific theory about this case. Every claim here gets checked against real federal law, real forensic science, and, wherever it applies, the specific evidence, statements, and figures this case has already produced. Hit subscribe if you want to see more analysis like this. Brian asks Geragos directly what he thinks was going on behind the FBI's sudden official statement, issued hours after a Reuters report claimed the notes were fake.
Full disclosure, you and I just are talking. Full disclosure, I knew exactly where that came from. That was, and I don't know if you know this, but I was told before it hit this morning that there was kind of a back and forth internally at the FBI, because the people who had been very dismissive of this, which is one wing of the FBI, and I'm not going to name which wing, but you and I probably would know, they put that out. That was a planted story, which, as you have rightfully pointed out, as we tape this on Wednesday evening, they just hours ago released an official statement. They have not released an official statement in recent memory. The reason they did that is precisely because that Reuters story was absolutely false, and they were played by somebody with an axe to grind in the FBI.
Geragos' account describes a real, well-documented phenomenon in public administration and criminology. Bureaucratic self-protection during a publicly scrutinized failure, sometimes called CYA behavior in organizational literature, where competing factions within an agency under criticism selectively leak information to shape blame away from themselves. The exact mechanism he names later in the same answer, describing different elements within the FBI doing damage control after glaring early missteps. Cross-checking this against the case file. This isn't a generic claim about bureaucracies. It directly explains a specific contradiction this series already flagged. An earlier Tell Index episode analyzed that same July 1st FBI statement line by line and coded it D7, excessive narrative control, because the statement stitched together 3 claims pulling in different directions. Some notes fake, some potentially real. The case still officially a kidnapping for ransom investigation. A structure built, that episode concluded, to satisfy every audience at once rather than clarify anything. Geragos' account gives that contradiction an actual origin story. Not one agency speaking with one voice, but 2 competing internal factions, one that wanted the notes publicly dismissed, one that didn't, producing a statement that had to hedge, because the internal disagreement itself hadn't been resolved. This also lines up with the task force's own visible behavior over time. Per l-balad.com quote, March 8th reporting, A formal task force was stood up specifically to coordinate the investigation, and the reward for information climbed in stages: $100,000 by mid-February, over $1 million by February 25th per NBC Palm Springs. A pattern that only makes sense if some part of the investigation still believed a monetary angle, including the notes, was worth funding heavily, even while another part was reportedly ready to call them fake. Brian asks Geragos to explain mechanically how someone with information could actually come forward without facing serious charges.
One of the things that often is done, and I will kind of manipulate it, if you will, they have what's called a queen for a day. That's generally the federal, but it's seeped into some of the states. It is a kind of an agreement between the government and the lawyer and the client that whatever they said can't be used against them except in certain discrete instances. You can negotiate that. If you want even further than that, then something, you've got use immunity, you've got transactional immunity, you have various ways to kind of reduce this to writing and make it an agreement.
This is real, foundational federal criminal law. The legal concept underlying use immunity traces to Castigar versus United States, 406 U.S. 441, 1972, in which the U.S. Supreme Court held that the government may compel testimony over a Fifth Amendment objection so long as neither that testimony nor any evidence derived from it is later used against the witness. The precise mechanism Geragos describes when he distinguishes use immunity from full transactional immunity, a broader and rarer grant that bars prosecution for the underlying conduct entirely. A proffer agreement, queen for a day, is a separate, narrower document governing only an initial interview before any formal cooperation agreement exists. Cross-checking this against the case file. This legal mechanism matters specifically here because of where the physical evidence in this case has already stalled. Per earlier reporting in this series, the DNA sample recovered from inside Nancy's own home, the one most likely tied directly to whoever committed the crime, came back as only a partial profile, was sent to the sheriff's private lab in Florida rather than the FBI's lab at Quantico, and was never entered into CODIS at all, because it fell short of the 8-core loci threshold the FBI's own national database standards require. Separately, DNA on gloves found roughly 2 miles from the scene did clear CODIS nationally and returned no match, and the one person briefly treated as a lead, detained in a Rio Rico traffic stop on February 10th, was released within hours. In other words, every physical evidence track this case has produced has either failed to clear a national database or led nowhere. An immunity deal isn't a hypothetical tool floated for a generic cold case. It's specifically the remaining lead type available once forensic tracks like these have already been exhausted, which is exactly the phrase multiple profilers in this series, including Fitzgerald later in this same episode, have used to describe where this investigation currently stands. Brian asks Geragos what it would actually look like if someone with real information decided to come forward.
I've had this, I'll give you a couple of instances. One of the most common is they will send an inquiry to my website. And the inquiry is, I don't want to reveal, but here is how you contact me. And I'll say, just call the office at X time from a block phone. That way you don't have to worry about being traced. I will tell them, give me the information. And I may test them because, unfortunately, you have a lot of people who have some mental challenges. And for every legitimate person, there may be 10 or 20 or exponentially more who aren't legitimate. But if you get a sense that they are legitimate, you then tell them, look, this is what I can do for you. You come in, I'll meet with you. You retain me. I will protect your anonymity. You give me what you have. I will then fashion what is, I think, enough information so that whoever I'm going to go to, the law enforcement, prosecutor, a lot of times I like dealing with the prosecutor first. And in cases like this, obviously a prosecutor is involved. And I will tell them, I think I've got credible information. Let me tell you what it is. You can test it out. I'm willing to go interactive.
Cross-checking this against the case file. This vetting process is the direct opposite, in both scale and method, of how this case has actually been generating leads. Per this series' earlier coverage, over 750 new tips came in within days of the reward increasing to $1 million in late February. And by day 89 of the case, retired profiler Raymond Carr described a source telling him the task force was fielding over 30,000 tips total, with investigators reportedly reduced to calling back people claiming to be psychics. A single attorney privately testing one specific claim before it ever reaches a prosecutor is a fundamentally different filtering process than a public hotline processing tens of thousands of unverified calls. And it's precisely the kind of channel that could produce a usable lead specifically because it screens out the volume problem this task force has publicly struggled with. Discussing why he doubts the Reuters report, Geragos raises a detail about NBC's own reporting pattern that Brian hadn't considered.
NBC News has been reporting about the ransom notes as recently as a couple days ago, last week, with sources saying this was in the note, this wasn't in the note. And you know that they are running these things by Savannah. I mean, or someone in her circle. They're not going to not tell her what they're reporting and make sure it's true. And the fact that they wouldn't be doing that if she thought the notes were fake.
She is a valued voice in that organization. They want her back, and they are trying desperately, and at least anybody that I know who's at NBC, and I know quite a few, I have friends there, that have said they bent over backwards to try to accommodate her and be, somewhat sympathetic or empathetic.
This inference rests on a real documented standard. The Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics instructs newsrooms to handle stories touching their own colleagues with particular care, precisely because of the institutional pressure Geragos describes. Cross-checking this against the case file. This isn't a new claim about Savannah's own beliefs. It's an outside legal analyst independently arriving at something Savannah has already said on the record. In her March interview with Hoda Kotb, already analyzed in an earlier Tell Index episode, Savannah stated directly that she believes the two notes sent to her family, as opposed to the separate TMZ notes, are real. Geragos, without referencing that interview at all, reaches the same specific split, the two family-directed notes versus the TMZ notes, from a completely different angle. Institutional behavior at NBC rather than Savannah's own words. Two independent readings landing on the identical distinction, real family notes, likely fake TMZ notes, is a stronger form of corroboration than either claim on its own, though it's worth noting neither Geragos nor Savannah's belief is the same as confirmed fact. The FBI's own July 1st statement, coded D7 in an earlier episode for its hedging, still hasn't said which specific notes it considers potentially legitimate. Before the ransom note discussion, Brian revisits a theory Fitzgerald has held from the start, and this time Fitzgerald explains the underlying reasoning in more detail than in his prior appearance in this series.
I believe this whole abduction was not about money. It was about a stalking of Savannah. He couldn't get to her, and what's the next thing he could do but steal her mother from her? The kids were too well protected, or they'd just be too difficult and deal with kids, whatever. And they took the mother. She probably did die early on.
This reasoning maps onto a real, named concept in threat assessment literature. Target displacement, where an offender fixated on a specific well-protected target redirects toward a less protected person connected to that target, in order to still achieve contact, harm, or attention linked to the original object of fixation. Forensic psychologist Reed Malloy's published research on stalking behavior specifically documents this pattern: displacement toward family members when the primary target is inaccessible, as a recognized risk factor threat assessment professionals are trained to watch for, not a theory invented for this case. Cross-checking this against the case file. This is Fitzgerald's second appearance in this series with this same theory, and the specifics are worth lining up side by side. In an earlier episode analyzing a panel discussion on day 89 of the case, Fitzgerald proposed reviewing every message Savannah had received over at least 5 years, reasoning from witnessed precedent drawn from his time overseeing security for NBC's own on-air staff. In this new clip, he adds the specific displacement logic, why Savannah's own children weren't targeted instead. That wasn't part of his argument in that earlier appearance. That earlier episode also noted his theory was independently echoed by Dr. Ann Burgess, who called the crime personal without being asked about Savannah specifically, and by a geographic profiler who read the first ransom notes direct addressed to Savannah as evidence she, not Nancy, was the offender's real focus. Fitzgerald's theory hasn't changed, but it has gotten more specific each time he's discussed it on the record, which is itself worth noting as a pattern in how his position has developed over 5 months. Brian plays a clip of Fitzgerald revising a specific phrase he has repeated publicly for months.
I've said these 3 words in the first month or two. Now I'm modifying it a bit. Proof of life, not game playing, machinations, something's hidden here, something's there. Now I'd ask for proof of death. If you want some money so we can recover the body, that's fine. Give us proof of death. And that could be done somehow. And just like with proof of life, this has all been game playing, circular information. They may have, lucky guesses early on with, the watch on the floor or whatever, or what she was wearing. I just think all these letters are bogus, and they're undertaken by opportunists.
Fitzgerald's original framing draws on a real standard protocol in the kidnap and ransom K&R response industry. Proof of life requests, specific, verifiable questions only the real hostage could answer, are documented standard practice among K&R insurers and negotiators, used specifically to confirm a demand is connected to a still living victim before any negotiation proceeds. His proposed adaptation, proof of death, applies the identical verification logic to a claim about a body. Cross-checking this against the case file, the $61,000 figure Fitzgerald cites is worth holding up directly against the actual demand in the 2 notes this series has already broken down in full, word by word, in an earlier episode. The first note demanded $4 million in Bitcoin, escalating to $6 million if a deadline was missed. A scammer asking for $61,000, roughly 1.5% of the original demand, is aiming for a number small enough to seem plausible to pay quietly, rather than large enough to match what the actual note writer asked for, which is itself a marker separating opportunist noise from the original note's own financial scale. Fitzgerald's broader point that the real abductor benefits from this kind of copycat noise also lines up with a detail already established in this series. The FBI's own statement explicitly distinguished notes deemed extortion attempts without legitimacy from ones still under investigation, meaning the Bureau's own language already assumes multiple separate note writers are operating in this case, not one consistent author. Brian and Fitzgerald discuss why a real kidnapper might not leave a note at the scene itself, and Fitzgerald draws on 2 cases he worked personally.
I worked the John Benet Ramsey case early on, and we knew by the time I was involved, there was a 3-page ransom note. It was nonsensical because it really wasn't a kidnapping. The young girl was found in the sub-basement of the house 6 hours after the police showed up. So it never was a kidnapping. But that note made a little more sense, explaining what happened, what's going to happen, how to wait for follow-up phone calls, things like that. And they could have handled it with gloves and made sure no DNA or anything else on it, and no paper marks, things like that. They could have written on some kind of a napkin or a leaf or something, just a piece of paper. We have your mother. We will call, or call this number. Something, of course, of a throwaway phone, a burner phone. Yeah, so that's really, if this was a serious kidnapping, that's the first thing that hit me. Again, because I don't think I ever worked. I helped with Sidney Riso case in Newark a little bit. And there was a Harvey Weinstein not that Harvey Weinstein. There was a tuxedo magnet in New York.
Both comparison cases are real, well-documented kidnappings with a genuine financial motive. In the 1992 kidnapping of Exxon executive Sidney Resso, forensic investigators recovered DNA directly from the physical ransom notes and from payphones the kidnappers used, evidence that directly led to convicting Arthur and Irene Seal. The tuxedo magnate is Harvey Weinstein, chairman of Lord West Formal Wear, kidnapped and buried alive for 12 days in 1993. A case cracked, partly because an accomplice referred to the victim during ransom calls as Mr. Harvey, an internal nickname only an insider would use, narrowing the suspect pool to Weinstein's own staff. Cross-checking this against the case file, both real cases produced exactly the kind of forensically exploitable material, handwriting, phone records, insider terminology, that the Guthrie notes, sent as an email to a local TV station and separately to TMZ, never could. That channel choice avoids fingerprint and paper trace evidence entirely, but this series has already documented what it introduces instead. The FBI reportedly tested the Bitcoin wallet address named in the first note by depositing a small trial amount, per the Daily Beast's earlier cited reporting, and the money went untouched, meaning no one was actually monitoring that wallet to collect. That test is the direct digital equivalent of the physical trace evidence Rizzo's and Weinstein's real kidnappers left behind without meaning to. A specific, checkable detail, a wallet address, that either does or doesn't behave the way a genuine monitored demand would. In Rizzo and Weinstein's cases, the physical evidence pointed toward real perpetrators. In this case, per that same Bitcoin test, the digital evidence pointed the opposite way for at least the notes tested. Fitzgerald then walks through, in specific forensic terms, what a genuinely careful kidnapper's note would look like.
And they could have, handled it with gloves and made sure no DNA or anything else on it, and no paper marks, things like that. They could have written on some kind of a napkin or a leaf or something, just a piece of paper. We have your mother. We will call, or call this number. Something, of course, of a throwaway phone, a burner phone.
Each element corresponds to a real forensic evidence category: latent fingerprint recovery from paper, indented writing, and paper batch analysis used to trace a specific ream or notepad to a point of purchase, and call detail records or cell site data that can geographically place a phone from even a single use. Cross-checking this against the case file, this exact level of forensic caution is precisely what's missing from how the Guthrie notes were actually delivered. Not physical objects requiring gloves or burner calls, but digital messages requiring IP logs, email headers, and account metadata instead, the digital era equivalent of what Fitzgerald describes. This series has already covered one specific instance of investigators working exactly this digital angle, the Bitcoin wallet test from round 7, and, in an earlier episode, the correction that the doorbell footage itself was recovered, not from a home Wi-Fi cache, but from Google's own cloud backend systems, meaning the actual forensic trail in this case has consistently been digital, not physical, at every point examined so far. Fitzgerald's gloves and napkins scenario describes the caution a truly careful physical world kidnapper would show. The fact that this case's real evidence trail runs through Bitcoin wallets and cloud servers instead suggests whoever is involved either didn't think as carefully about the digital version of that same caution, or wasn't thinking about long-term evasion at all, consistent with Fitzgerald's own broader read that money may never have been the primary goal. A defense lawyer's account of an internal FBI leak that gives this series' own D7 finding an actual origin story, the real federal contract law behind an immunity deal, mattering specifically because this case's own DNA evidence has already stalled twice. The private selective process a real tip goes through, set against 30,000 unverified calls this task force has already fielded. A network's own reporting pattern independently landing on the exact split Savannah herself already described to Hoda Kotb. A profiler's stalker theory getting more specific with each appearance in this series. 3 words, quietly revised, next to a $61,000 figure that doesn't match this case's real $4 million demand. 2 real kidnappings cracked by evidence this case's own notes were never going to produce. And a forensic caution checklist that this case's real evidence trail, Bitcoin wallets, cloud servers, never had to pass. Which of these 8 points stood out most to you? Leave a comment below. I read everyone, and hit subscribe to see more analysis like this.